what I'm going to be talking over the next 30 minutes is going to be a little bit on integrative medicine and a little bit of the different opportunities and challenges that we have with integrative medicine. I do have some ownership that I definitely want to disclose. But the first thing is that when we're talking about integrative medicine, it's not going to be a sweet topic. And as it says in this cartoon, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to sugarcoat it. And I'm going to have to really tell the ins and outs. And there's been developments even over the past 48 hours in this topic that I'm going to be highlighting. And why is that important? The biggest issues that we've forgotten quite a bit of more traditional medical concepts, like what Sir William Osler said as one of the earlier clinicians of already 2 centuries ago, that he used to say that a good physician treats the disease, but the great physician treats the patient that has the disease. And that's part of what integrative medicine does. It's not just focusing on the specific markers, and as much as I am also one of the investigators of a lot of the PD-1s and a lot of the targeted agents and all that, if we were simplistic enough to just talk about that marker as the disease and that's going to be what the patient needs to completely heal themselves, we are oversimplifying medicine, and it will not be making it something that appeals to the current concept that we have of medicine. Now, I always have to define when I'm giving lectures regarding integrative medicine, which is a topic that I studied for the past, it's already going to be maybe 6 to 7 years when I did my fellowship of integrative medicine at the University of Arizona. And we used to struggle with the definition of integrative medicine, even at the time when the National Institute of Health created what it's called the National Complementary and Alternative Medicine Institute, which is another brand similar to the National Cancer Institute. When we were starting some of the studies and started to look at all this data, and we were saying, what is integrative medicine? And the definition that was kind of like concocted at that time was that integrative medicine is healing-oriented medicine that takes into account the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, including all aspects of lifestyle. So we're not focusing only on the disease. We're not focusing only on just the aspect that brought the patient to our office, but we're looking at everything else. And it emphasizes the therapeutic relation and makes use of all appropriate therapies. Even if they are found to be non-conventional, we like to be open-minded and take them into consideration. Now, it's very different than alternative medicine. And when a patient comes to me and tells me, no, I'm only going to try alternative medicine, which entails I'm not going to be trying the scientific developments and the knowledge that we have and all those type of things, I usually tell the patients, not under my supervision, because that probably will land you in one of these places, in an alternative funeral home, in which we cannot negate the developments of what we have done in the past several years. Now, one of the issues, and the reason that I'm putting it back here in the slide, is because in integrative medicine, we neither reject or accept either one of the two therapies. The same way that when I'm with my residents and with my fellows and we're discussing clinical trials and we're kind of like reviewing a journal article and we're kind of like discussing if the article is valid or not, if the endpoint was a valid endpoint, by the same token, we are evaluating some of the other non-conventional therapies. Now, one thing that we always have to take in mind when we're looking at that is the risk-benefit of the different therapies. And if I'm going to be giving a patient a chemotherapy that has a toxicity that is extremely high and that even has the probability of having toxicity that could even be lethal for the patient, I really need to be having very good level of evidence to recommend that. But if I'm going to be recommending to a patient, why don't you try eating a little bit more broccoli every day? Do I need the same level of evidence to make that recommendation? And yes, I know that is not completely scientific, but I cannot reject it completely. And on the other hand, we always have that concept that we promote to our residents that we're training also in integrative medicine at Sinai that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In which, for me not to know absolutely for certain in a huge clinical trial sponsored by 7 institutions, conducted in 10 different countries, that exercising 20 to 30 minutes per day is beneficial, if I know that I'm not harming the patient, it's something that I feel that maybe we can discuss during our visit and we can move on. Now, in oncology, it's a little bit different. And we have even come up with a definition of what it is, integrative oncology, because there's even a society of integrative oncology that I also participate quite actively. And what it is defined is as the evidence-based combination of conventional and complementary interventions to address the whole person in, again, body, mind, and spirit, okay? Now, if we start talking of the different concepts of integrative medicine, and you'll see that there's plenty, one of the most common things that we tend to forget is nutrition. And it's extremely sad to see that in medical school, most of us were never taught anything about nutrition. And that even when I talk to, like, for instance, my brother that is a cardiologist, and I tell him, how many patients you saw this week with high cholesterol? And he says, like, probably all of them. And I said, how many of them did you talk about diet? And he laughs at me, and I always tell him, like, don't forget, cholesterol being high is not a deficiency of pharmaceuticals that need to be given to lower the cholesterol. Cholesterol being high is a dietary problem in most of the cases. And the problem is that the modern kitchen is looking like this, and with all those chemical additives and things like that. And this is something that was given to me by a photographer friend that was doing a campaign with us, and he said, oh, I have a great picture that you're gonna like that we used to use in promotions. And he had this, and the actual label that you see there as nutrition facts was actually the label of that hamburger that he brought frozen in the supermarket. So you can tell what you really are putting in your body, it's not really what the biggest issue is. And believe it or not, this year, 2017, the #1 preventable cause of cancer is going not to be tobacco cessation, but nutrition. So obesity is going to account this year of 35% of the cancers that could be prevented in the world are going to be obesity linked and nutrition related. That's something that we need to be focusing. So that's quite important. Now, the problem that we have, and mostly when we're talking to symposiums like here with the Debbie's Dream Foundation, is that a lot of this research is being conducted mostly on breast cancer patients and survivors, and that's something that we shouldn't do, and we should focus in all the other cancers. One of the explanations actually for the graph that was presented earlier of the statistics of cancer and showing that sharp decline of gastric cancer over the past 60 to 70 years, in a good part could be just refrigeration. And the advent of refrigeration and modern refrigeration techniques, instead of pickling and doing a lot of other conservation techniques that used to be done in the past, could account for quite a bit of those cancers that have been decreasing. We would love to take all the credit, but the credit could be from other places. Now, the second problem is that we tend to focus in our oncology research, and I'm going to talk a little bit on this a little bit later, mostly on what we call grades 3 and 4 toxicity. Grade 3 and 4 toxicity means that we create a toxicity with our treatments that is severe enough to require medical intervention, that either the patient has to come to our office to get like hydration or be admitted to a hospital. That doesn't mean that the patients are not having toxicities that are grade 1 and 2, that are mild, still interfere with the quality of life, but we've been focusing quite a bit of just the higher grade toxicities. And why? Because for the past several years, and oncology being a new science, cancer patients were expected to be sick. And that's not something that we should continue to accept. Now, the second problem is that weight loss and malnutrition tend to be a common problem, and you'll see that's actually the focus of one of the research projects that we have now at Sinai. And the patient-reported outcomes of the patients telling us what they feel that is important, instead of me looking at a graph and seeing at a graph just numbers in which 50% of the patients may be alive at a completely random period of time, or the patient's not progressing in whatever time I decide to make the scans, it's not the same type of outcome when the patient tells me like, oh, I felt great with this chemo, I was able to keep on with my work, go on with my life, and attend all the events in the school of my kids. So patient-reported outcomes were mostly at the pharmaceutical level, and we're going to bring them back into a lot of our research of integrative medicine. Now, that's going to require a lot of personalization. That's going to require that type of, when people discuss personalized medicine, it's not only on the drugs that we're going to use, it's also of looking at the patient in a very individual, because of his goals and aspirations may be completely different than the goals of aspiration of the other patient that is going to receive the next drug as well. And the other problem that we see is that the complementary and alternative medicine used in our patient population in oncology, as much as we want to avoid those discussions during our clinic time because we want to get on with our day, talk about the important things being like, are you doing well with the drug, and I keep giving you the drug and you come back in 2 weeks, the patients are using a lot of complementary and alternative medicine. And the reason for that, in order, and this actually it's from a study in which we were asked the patients to tell us why were they using complementary and alternative medicines. The last one was scientific evidence, and that shouldn't be also the case. We should be moving and pushing that as well further up instead of keeping it to the other level. Now, what made the news this week is that 2 days ago, the FDA rendered letters to 14 nutraceutical companies to cease and desist the promotion of products to cure cancer. And the main ingredients of those products were from vitamin C to graviola, which is something that has been very little research. And what people get confused is that they say, no, it's FDA approved. I see it all the time in every natural health food store. That means that I can take it. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is a regulatory agency and not an enforcement agency. So as much as they can send a letter to tell the companies cease and desist, all that they are really saying is your label is not compliant to what we find appropriate, because they're saying we're curing cancer with that label that they posted in the product that was on the shelf of any natural health food store. But the enforcement arm is the Federal Trade Commission, in which they can go over and tell that company, you are infringing the law and we're going to prosecute you. But the FDA, the most that they can do, the reach is really to the point of just sending those cease and desist letters, and all the supplements and all the different things that you see in the stores are mostly considered food. So that's a problem, and the patients need to be cognizant of that, and we need to keep informing our patients that it's not something that they can trust just because it's available on the shelf with the approved indication. This we talked already on the reasons that people use complementary and alternative medicine, and you can see that they go all the way even to conventional treatments could be too expensive, which we don't like to see. We would love to see that everybody gets the coverage that they need for their standard treatments. And then the number of treatments, and this is a list actually that I made one day on a plane that I was going to give a lecture, and just kind of like off the top of my head, I started to put a list of all the different things that I've heard in my office and all the different alternative therapies that my patients have reported, and we kind of like can summarize all those into really nutrition that I talked shortly a little bit, and I'll tell you a little bit more, mind and body practices, manipulation practices, spirituality, energy, and whole body systems. I'm going to talk 1 or 2 slides on each one of them. And nutrition and cancer is it's a problem. Because the problem is that we tend to do retrospective data set analysis in which we ask the patients, what are you eating? How's your diet? And as you can tell in this cartoon, only Snoopy really knew what he was eating. So that's one of the issues. And the second thing is that with the label that I show you of the hamburger, do you really know what you're eating? Are you really eating beef or whatever is coming in that hamburger, or what you really have is the list of ingredients that should be listed, as it says also in this cartoon, after profit? And then the products that we're eating, and I just came back from giving a lecture in South America yesterday, and you can tell the difference of what it's been eaten in the different places. Not that they have less amount of trouble. Actually, I was in a lecture in Chile, and we're trying to figure out why they have the highest incidence of gallbladder cancer in the world, and we're discussing with them all the different research that we can do. But if you were to see this wheat farm as the source of the product that you're going to eat of any wheat-related product, but then it starts processing to a drier wheat, to just the kernels, and then the kernels are collected, they're grinded, they keep grinding them, processing, and then they end up with this powder that is very unlike what you saw in the farm originally of that nice green product. And do we have absolute evidence that the amount of processing may be harmful? To a certain extent, because we know that increased processing of products increases the exposure area of that product to our absorption surfaces, and there is actually some data to suggest that the glycemic index, which means how much the sugar spikes in the body after you eat something, with a product that is much more processed than something that is not as processed, can have some changes in the body metabolism, and there's quite a bit of cancer pathways that involve what is called the insulin growth factor, and they're being studied quite actively. And that's part of the reason that even, again, an old physician and philosopher also said that no illness that should be treated with diet should be treated by any other means. And the obesity rates that we're seeing in our country, this is just the curves, as you see our country changing from 1990 to 2010 to have now the whole southern states with over 30% of body mass index of above 30. That means that the patients are eligible for a gastric bypass. When you meet them, 1 out of every 3 people that you see in these states would be eligible for a gastric bypass. And everybody tries to be simplistic of how do you correct the diet, and they're like, oh no, that's easy, I'll take this supplement, I'll take this other supplement. And as it was said in this article from Forbes magazine, it says like, take any reports of disease-preventing vitamins with a grain of salt. When this is all sorted out, it could turn out that what we will have to take is 50 or 60 different nutrients to get a real benefit. That is a possibility. It's called broccoli. In a single place, 50 or 60 nutrients, okay? Now, switching gears quickly to mind and body medicine, that's the definition of the interactions of the brain and the mind affecting the body functions. And Plato was already focusing on this in Greece, which he said that the greatest error of our day in the treatment of human body is that physicians separate the soul from the body. And you can tell that even when we talk about immunotherapy, stress is an immunosuppressor. So maybe can we enhance the studies that Dr. Ilson is doing with PD-L1 by telling the patients, would you mind to meditate 20 minutes a day and decrease your stress level, see if the cortisol level, which is the same as prednisone, which is what we use for immunosuppression, decreases, and maybe making the patients more feasible or active to get those drugs in their body and be able to tolerate them better. I don't know. We'll need to do some of the studies. Would we be harming anyone that it's on any of Dr. Ilson's studies, or would he opposes if one of his patients that it's even on study, we tell him like, why don't you just do yoga and meditate a little bit even while you're on the study? Probably not. And that's one of the issues. Energy medicine. Energy medicine is a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more out there, but includes all the different things like acupuncture, Reiki. We do a lot of these interventions in our center because we find them to be, again, non-harmful. And the problem with this is that if you go back to the origins of these therapies, they are what is called whole body system therapies. If you talk to a Chinese or an Oriental doctor, because there's even acupuncture from other places besides China, and you tell them, what's the meridian that you're treating and what are you doing? He's like, I'm not treating the meridian. I'm moving the chi, the energy, towards the place that I feel that it needs to be treated. Treating a single meridian makes it very simplistic, okay? So that's also something that requires quite a bit of issues. And then the limitations of this type of research, when we're talking about like spirituality research and to see if surrogate praying might help and all that, imagine designing a clinical study of that. If we try to design a study of telling the patients, okay, we're going to have half of the patients in their temples, church, or place of worship, the people pray for you so that you get better, and the other half, we will tell them not to pray for you. Am I really going to be able to control that study? And then it depends of where do you pray, who prays, and all the different things. In botanical medicine, and to close in the next 5 minutes, it could be harmful, and it could be dangerous. This is actually an envelope that I pick up at a local Home Depot to grow it. Usually when I show this to my residents, I ask them to tell me what foxglove is, that beautiful purple flower. And foxglove, usually not recognized by many of the younger physicians, but it is something, if you see, it's digitalis purpurea, which is what the cardiologists use for certain types of cardiac arrhythmias called digoxin. And you can see on the yellow box moved, but if you go a little bit above that yellow box, it says poisonous if eaten. So imagine if you grow that nice bush or flowers in your house and you just decide to make a stew out of them and you get digitalis toxicity just by eating it, and you could actually. Don't get ideas. Now the problem is that my patients, this is actually something, a patient of mine that walked into my office for an integrative medicine consult, and a lot of my integrative medicine patients come in with these bags. Actually, this one had a card. You can see that a rolling card with all the vitamins. This patient had been also diagnosed by the previous oncologist as having what we call malignant hypercalcemia, an extremely high level of calcium that they were blaming on the tumor. And what this patient was taking was 3 different supplements that were raising her calcium level to the point that when we stop all that, we cure the so-called malignant hypercalcemia. It was malignant by the nutraceutical companies and by the patient not having good advice on what supplements to take. So that segue into some of the other supplements. They asked me to touch the base a little bit on medicinal marijuana, that it's been the topic here in Florida for the past 2 years actually, and it's something that we're working quite a bit. I think that I was the first oncologist that was able to prescribe marijuana in the state of Florida legally. A lot of people were prescribing it in the corners. But the problem is that when you look at the history of marijuana, it's a complex history, and it's a botanical like any other. Like the same as the digitalis that I show you that could be problematic, and marijuana goes back to Oriental medicines. It's called in Chinese dama, and you can see this is a shaman or a traditional Chinese doctor, and he was buried with, on the 2 sides, you see those pots, and they were seeds of marijuana, which probably were used in some type of rituals in those ancient times. Believe it or not, marijuana until 1920, more or less, and a little bit before that, definitely in the late 1800s, it was the primary component of the number 1, number 2, and number 3 prescribed substance in the United States. With the advent of the narcotics, of the opioids, morphine, and some of the different things, it started to decrease in the use. And what happened afterward is that a lot of the different countries started to change the legislation, criminalizing it, and the interest started to decrease quite a bit until the 70s, when there were some anecdotal reports of therapeutic interventions with marijuana. It really, I give a lecture that is like an hour of marijuana to my residents, and when you look at the history, it really became the target of the prohibitionists when alcohol became decriminalized. And then the clinical trials have mostly focused in cancer regarding nausea and vomiting. And there's some randomized clinical trials that tetrahydrocannabinoid, THC, is better than placebo or equivalent to some of the pharmaceuticals that we use. It is definitely better inhaled. I wouldn't call it smoked because that doesn't mean there's a different levels of what we call combustion of the leaves of the actual pods of the marijuana, and there's many other uses. The biggest interest that we have at this time is if maybe we can use what is called the side effect of marijuana. So when the patients are getting high, the euphoria and things like that, as a really an adverse event, or we can use it as something that the patients, like for instance, that are experiencing severe fatigue from chemotherapy, could benefit from. And we're actually proposing a clinical trial. It's not easy. I still need to run the clinical trial to what is called the NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Addiction, not only through the FDA, and it's taking almost an act of Congress to be able to run these studies, to the point that there's some interest in running the studies abroad, in South America and in some other places, that the legislation is a little bit more easy to navigate. And then the other problem is if it might help also for anorexia, the munchies of marijuana. How many cancer patients that you have dealt with, the family says like, oh my God, he or she is not eating anything. How do we get him to eat? And then what do we want him to eat? Do we want him just to eat bad calories, to tell him go and get a milkshake in an ice cream store? Sometimes yes, because it's a war type of situation that you need to get the calories in any way. But if the patient will just have the munchies and start eating a good salad, will be good. And it will not be a bad side effect. It will be something that we can do. It started to be much more open. This is a picture of a dispensary in California that I just took in one of the trips. And the interesting thing is that people tell me, oh, it's toxic, it's a drug, it's a stepping stone into higher drugs. It could be very harmful. There's not a single death to the current day reported for marijuana. The lethal dose of alcohol, you've heard of the kids that take the 21 shots of alcohol the day that they become 21, and that some kids may die because of the shots they can get very rapid acute alcohol toxicity. That's the lethal dose of marijuana would be 300 cigarettes, and the cause of death would be carbon monoxide poisoning, not marijuana. So there's a lot to be said of a product that we have in our armamentarium that we've been so difficult to study. Now, what's the problem with botanical research? I always give the example. Precisely yesterday in Chile, I was talking with the doctors there a little bit on this, and if I tell in a show of hands how many people are red wine drinkers, I will have a good part of the room, and then I would say how many are white wine drinkers. But both of them are products of grapes. Why would I say that a plant like marijuana or any other botanical, I have like 3 clinical studies now running with some plants with the botanical garden here, but why would I say that the leaf, the root, the stem, the fruit, the pulp, frozen, cooked, there's so many different connotations when you're doing botanical research that it's extremely difficult to standardize, and you really have to design it well. With marijuana, it's no different. There's 3 species of marijuana and easily 700 hybrids. There's sativa, indica, and ruderalis, and each one of them has different characteristics in the way that they behave. And all of them are cannabinoids, the same as hemp. So you cannot really do it. Now, the type of extract, if you're going to do oil, if you're going to concentrate it to higher levels, what dose, and then how do you control the placebo group, which was an issue when we did a study for taste alterations, to tell the patients, do not eat this. How do you do it? We're running out of time. How are you doing that? So let me just quickly run through some of these things, and the problem is that we are now at an advent where we're needing to collect a lot of this data, and we have a lot of interest now in starting some better ways of collecting data. A lot of patients are using smartphones, and we're starting some different trials to try to see if the use of some of these botanicals, integrative medicine interventions will be better, and the use of wearable devices is quite high. This week we had the first conference call of what we call in the Alliance, which is one of the clinical trial networks, a group to try to look at all these wearable devices as we get all this into better shape to collect the data of these patients. And again, to finish what I told you in the beginning, that really when we're looking at integrative medicine, the safety of the treatment is what should push the level of evidence needed to accept the intervention. And this was given to me by a patient from South America that she said, like, oh, look at this nice stand that I took a picture there in South America. It translates pharmacy. That this is what it used to be, our pharmacy, and we should go back to take some of it from here as well. And with that, I'll be more than glad to entertain any other questions.
Great.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you.